Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Faith and Finance Forum, hosted by the Catholic Finance Association and presented by Aquinas Wealth Advisors. We have a great show for you today. We have Catherine Flax as our special guest. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Shall we start with a prayer?
Please.
In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, amen. Well, Catherine, this is such a privilege to have you on today. I know you're so busy. We appreciate you giving us some time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much. It's an exciting time for sure.
Yeah, and it's nice to be connecting during Lent, which is a special holy season for both of us. Did you give up anything this year?
I did. It's funny because usually coming into Lent, I have a really good idea of what I want to give up or what I need to give up to really draw me closer to the heart of Jesus. And I really had a hard time this year figuring out what was the thing. And I was listening to a podcast. I don't know if you ever listened to Father Josh, Ask Father Josh, but when I drive, I really like listening to him. And he had a really wonderful segment on Lent. And he was talking about different things that he had given up. And he was talking about giving up hitting the snooze button on the alarm and getting out, not just jumping right out of bed, but jumping right up onto your knees in prayer. And as soon as he said that, I thought that's exactly what I need to do. And it's been such a blessing. I'm not going to say it's easy because sleep is always something that I really, I get excited about given all things that are going on, but jumping out of bed and just getting into prayer right away, it's a beautiful thing.
Wow, well said. I'm going to try that. I like that a lot. I think that's a great discipline to fall into. And I hit the snooze button every morning, so that'd be really
Hard
hard for
not
me.
to, right?
All right, so Catherine Flax, she's the president of private markets at X Machina Capital. She brings decades of experience in building successful businesses in commodities, financial services, technology, and professional services. She sits on the board of ISO New England, ABXX Technologies, Astor Perkins, Base Carbon, and Amperon. Most recently, Catherine served as CEO of Pefin. Am I saying that right, Catherine? Is it
Pefin.
Pefin? Pefin, thank you.
Pefin.
Pefin, the world's first artificial intelligence financial advisor. Earlier, she worked at BNP Paribas, where she served as CEO, commodities, foreign exchange, and emerging markets. Catherine also worked at JP Morgan, serving as both CMO globally as well as CEO, commodities, EMEA. She also previously served as a board member for JP Morgan Securities Limited, Digital Asset Holdings, and the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, or SIMFA. Catherine earned her BS in economics at Texas A&M University and her MA in economics from Brown University. In 2011, she was named the most influential woman in European financial markets. She also is a board member at Cristo Rey Brooklyn High School, Career Spring, Aggies on Wall Street program at Texas A&M University, as well as a trustee of the Holy Family Church in New York City. Catherine, what a run you've had. It's such a privilege to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, where you grew up. Help our audience get to know Catherine Flax a little bit.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Massachusetts, and I grew up with my parents, wonderful people they were. My mom's still living, and my sister. And I would say that, often when I think about my childhood, the thing that really I think was a real galvanizing force for us as a family was my dad had a pizza shop. And if you ever, meet anyone who grew up in a family with a small business, that's a real opportunity for families to work very closely together. And I started working at a very young age, probably around 11 or 12, really working full time. My husband often says that I didn't have a childhood, but I completely disagree with that. I think I had a wonderful childhood. It was just one where there was a lot of working together as a family, and there's a lot of joy that comes from that.
You know who you have that in common with is Maria Bartiromo. She was a pizza shop family too. Yeah, her first job was checking coats.
Well, and I often say that my actual greatest skill is I can make really good sub sandwiches. That's like that's my actual gift. So whenever I need to feel good about what I can do, I make somebody a sandwich, and then I'm really happy.
That counts for a lot. I love it. So From that start, you ended up at Texas A&M for college. Tell us about your college experience and what that was like.
Sure. Growing up in Massachusetts, in a family of limited means, we didn't really travel very much, and I had never been to Texas until the day that I showed up on campus to start at Texas A&M. And it was really just because I wanted to do something different, wanted to experience a different place. And I grew up in a family where my grandparents were all very devout, but my parents had both kind of gone through this crisis of faith right around the time that I was born, and so they had sort of stepped away from the church. And so I was really raised in a situation where it was not central to our lives. And when I went to Texas A&M, one of the things that really struck me from almost day one was how much faith was a part of the conversation there at A&M. And initially, I thought it was really weird, to be honest. But it was actually, it's funny how you see God working in your life when you get to, look in the rear view mirror. And it was really clear that there were a lot of people that were brought into my life in those years at Texas A&M, and just the witness that a lot of people had about how important Jesus was in their life. That was a real transformative step for me to have an openness to faith that I hadn't had before. Of course, I also learned a lot about economics and what I studied and all of that, which was great. But I think that the really important part of my time at Texas A&M was around the beginnings of a real faith journey.
So this is very interesting. A lot of young people when they go to college lose their faith. It sounds like you kind of discovered it a little bit, right?
It was the beginning for sure. I mean, it took me a few years after college before I actually, became a Christian, and then years after that when I actually became a Catholic. But it was the first time I think that I saw people actively talking about it and really trying to live their faith in an explicit, overt way. And it really has stuck with me when I think about what are the things that I can do that might be influencing people. And I know there's a part in scripture where it talks about, one person plants, another person waters, another person harvests. That whole idea that you don't necessarily get to see the fruits of your witness, somebody else might actually reap. And I know in my case, I'm sure there were so many people that came across me as a young person who feel like, wow, I really shared Jesus with her, but she was hopeless. And they don't, and you don't really get to know. So I take comfort in that when I talk to people thinking, well, I may never get to see that eventually they're going to come home, but, hopefully that a little bit of planting or watering or whatever that I'm doing might have the impact that those people had on me.
Yeah, it's interesting, Catherine, because I mean, just to hear you talk about how in your childhood, perhaps you weren't as into all this. I mean, it's such a big part of your life now. You're a very kind of out, expressive, practicing Roman Catholic. Talk to us about where you're at with your faith today. I mean, are there any devotions or any particular practices of the Catholic faith that are important to you?
Well, there's some pretty simple ones that are very important to me. Certainly, saying the Rosary every day has become a practice really only in the last, I would say, 4 years, and it's one of those things where I started it off 1 October. That was, a month of the Rosary, and once I got started on it, it was almost like my day wasn't complete unless I said the Rosary. And now, 4 years later, really seeing the fruits of that, the peace of that, but also how dynamic it is to say the Rosary, because there are some times, as you know, that you're called to really ponder these mysteries. There are other times that you feel really called to be praying on behalf of someone else. There's other times where you just really need to feel like those arms of Mary and Jesus around you when you're really, in a troubled time, and that Rosary is there to bring you closer. So all of that is just really beautiful. So I'm really, blessed to have that as a daily practice. But I also think that, in the last few years, I became a Dame of Malta. And so in that too, just that rolling up the sleeves and participating in service to the sick and the poor in a physical way, that is something that we don't always get to do. Sometimes the more senior we get, or you get busy with work or whatever, the sort of, well, I'm contributing by writing a check or whatever that is, and there's, I mean, that's important too. There's nothing wrong with that at all, and hopefully we're doing that too. But also that opportunity to actually be of service to somebody, I think is really beautiful and wonderful. And so that particularly through the Order of Malta, there's been a number of opportunities for me, both in terms of prison ministry and in terms of working with the Sisters for Life, that have been really, really impactful.
Prison ministry. What's that like?
Well, for me, it's Penpal, and I have to tell you that this was actually, it doesn't sound like much really to be a pen pal to somebody in prison, but it's been actually really challenging for me. The fellow who is my pen pal is a Muslim man who's from Somalia. And we began writing, and on the one hand, we have our, even though we're a different faith, he's very sincere, and his faith is really important to him, as is mine. And so we found that writing about our faith journeys has been a place of bonding. But I'll tell you that what was really hard for me, I don't really even know what possessed me, but earlier on in our experience of being pen pals, I looked up why he was in jail. And he is incarcerated because he raped a child. And I will tell you that that was really hard I really had a moment of like, wow, do I really want to be this guy's pen pal? Like, as a mother and a grandmother, like it was really, I had a moment of just like, ugh. But I think this is exactly why God put me in this place, because understanding that God's forgiveness is bigger than all of that. And, we're all sinners. And there are things that I've done in my life, just as we all have as a sinner, where somebody would be like, oh, wow, that person's not worthy. But that's not up to me to do that. My job is to love people and to try to share Jesus with them. And then God can do the sorting when the day comes. That's not up to me. But so, you never know why you're brought on this journey, but God certainly knows.
Wow, the radical love that Christ teaches us to love the sinner. I can't think of too many episodes that resemble that more than the one you just described. That's pretty remarkable. Wow, truly impressive. And it's interesting, Kathy, because you clearly have a lot going on, just like everybody listening to the show does. But every day you make time for the Rosary. It's that big of a priority for you.
It really is. And I try to do it in the morning before the day begins, but I don't always get there. But then I definitely do it before the night goes. And then I'm also blessed that my youngest son has now, who's 17, he loves to say the Rosary too. So our schedules don't always align, but sometimes they do. And it's really beautiful to be able to say the Rosary with your child, as you know. It's a wonderful thing.
No, it really is. I totally agree. So you graduated from Texas A&M. I'm curious when you were at A&M and studying economics. Did you have any idea that you would become a corporate executive and a CEO and all the things you've done? What did you dream of being when you were
With
young?
both, I knew so little about the world of Wall Street when I was growing up, since that was not the world that my parents were in. And so I figured I liked math. I minored in finance. I thought it was all just super interesting. I had no idea what the job opportunities were. And when I was coming out of undergrad, I was applying to jobs and I was applying to grad school, and I figured whatever looked better, I would just go with that. And so it turned out that grad school ended up looking better. So I went to grad school, and my initial thought was, well, maybe I should be a professor. And I actually did teach at the University of Nebraska for a few years. And frankly, it's the job I liked the least out of any job I've ever had. I will go back to waitressing before I would go back to being a professor. I just didn't enjoy it at all. But it was my older kids were little at that time. It worked out well scheduling wise. But it was really a very organic process of learning about real working in financial services and all of that. And it's really started, I was in Oklahoma because of my husband's job, and was issuing municipal bonds for the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was fun, but doesn't pay particularly well. And there was a trading floor there, Williams Companies, and they were trading oil and gas. And I didn't know anything about oil and gas, but I knew a decent amount about pricing derivatives. And so they hired me in there. And that was sort of the beginning of my journey working on trading floors. And I really had no idea, kind of this whole world in its scope existed. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful journey since then.
Wow, fascinating. So from Tulsa, where'd you go next? And when did you first kind of to move into finance and corporate leadership?
Well, so from the trading floor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it was actually kind of funny. My boss at the time was a nice man who I went to at one point and said, hey, I was in a very analytical role. And I said, I'd love to be able to be interfaced with clients directly. And he said, well, that's not our model. You're either analytical or you're client facing. But he said, confidentially, I'm applying for a job at Morgan Stanley. And so if you want to come with me, then if you come to New York, then you can do both analytical work and client-facing work. And so anyway, long story short, I got the job at Morgan Stanley and he didn't. And so then there was this awkward moment of resigning and him trying to talk me out of it, whatever. So that was actually 1998, which, now seems like a lifetime ago. But so, almost 25 years ago, I moved to New York and started at Morgan Stanley. And then eventually moved over to JP Morgan, which is where I ended up running, much larger businesses, and was there for about 8 years doing that. And so it was really, I feel very privileged to have had such wonderful experiences on Wall Street, worked with some great people, wonderful bosses that I had and coworkers. And just really, I think for me, the most important thing is to wake up feeling excited about what I'm learning every day, and just really have had tremendous opportunities to do that and still do.
I'm curious, from the humble start in New England that you described earlier, college in Texas, working in Oklahoma, all of a sudden you're in Midtown Manhattan. Did New York come naturally to you, or did it take some adjustment?
It's funny. I started coming to New York for business when I was working in Oklahoma, and my first thought was sort of, how do people live here? Like, and why, And then I started to get to know people here, and I thought, okay, I can get why some people would want to live here. But as a mom, I was thinking, how could you possibly have kids here? Then I started to get to know some people that had kids, and so it was a real gradual process of sort of getting comfortable with it. And then my older kids were around 8 and 10 when we moved to the city, and they loved it. Like from day one, they just really took to it. And so that certainly made it a lot easier. But yeah, there were definitely a lot of challenges. It wasn't just living in the city, but the sort of Wall Street life with kids was not easy. But then there's a big gap between number one, number two, and then my third child. And so I kind of feel like by the time the third one rolled around, it was really easy. And he was born and raised in Manhattan. So, for him, that's kind of all he knows.
Sure. So, Catherine, you progressed up the ranks in the corporate world very quickly. What do you attribute that success to? I mean, it's pretty phenomenal how quickly you moved up.
Well, thank you very much. I think anybody who says that there's not, luck and good fortune or God's grace or however you want to frame it, that they'd just be not telling the truth. So there's definitely that. I mean, I do feel like I benefited a lot from the right place at the right time for sure. But I also do feel like luck favors the prepared, and the harder you're willing to work and try things, I think that certainly does help a lot for sure. I think that the other thing too is that actually starting with really humble beginnings, I think is a really big help, because you're a little bit less fearful about what you're going to lose, but if you make a misstep. So I feel like I was a lot more willing to try other jobs and, new roles and things like that, because what's the worst thing that can happen? I mean, the worst thing that can happen is I end up waitressing again. And I kind of liked that. So it's just not so bad. It's not that big of a deal.
Burn the boat. I like it.
Yeah, why not?
So,
Big deal.
So Catherine, you quickly are leading teams, managing people. You have colleagues working under you. Describe your leadership philosophy. How do you approach management, inspiring the best from the people that you're called to lead and serve?
Well, I do feel like managing people well is an underappreciated discipline. And I also feel like too often we assume that people are either naturally good leaders and managers or they aren't. And I don't believe that that's the case at all. I do think that you can learn to be a good leader and a good manager of people. One of the things that I did when I left corporate life for a little while before starting with the work that I'm doing now was I worked at coaching senior leaders in other companies. And I did that through an organization in Pennsylvania called CRA. And what really attracted me to the work at CRA was that they've spent the last, call it 30 years, really researching what makes exceptional leaders different from other leaders. And so I really wanted to work with CRA because I thought that's information I want to have. And what better way to force myself to learn it than to actually do it and to coach other people. So I spent a couple of years really deep diving with the research that CRA did. And so what that did is certainly reinforced to me that idea that you can learn how to be a good leader. And you don't have to do everything that every good leader, no good leader does everything, but you can kind of pick what matters. But I would say one of the things that was a huge takeaway for me, both in coaching leaders and also, learning through that information is there's unfortunately not enough directness and honesty in most workplaces to give people the necessary feedback that they can really use to get better. And giving people like really concrete, tangible things to do that will make them better is usually people don't want to have that much of a direct conversation with people, so they just don't say it. And when you really observe that, then what it caused me to do was to reflect on what, as a leader of people, have I been as direct with people as I could have been or should have been? But in the interest of being nice or wanting to think of myself as a nice person, have I been a little bit more kind of opaque or, just kind of try to massage things a little bit? So I'd say the biggest difference for me now in running a company than before I really kind of did that deep dive is I think I make a concerted effort to be way more clear with people, like, you aren't doing this well, let's make sure that you're hearing what I'm saying, but really doing it from a spirit of love. And really, because you care about somebody, you really want them to do better in their role and be successful, you have to be willing to have those hard conversations.
Wow, and that is really one of the most challenging aspects of leadership, isn't it? In management in particular, that this notion of giving constructive feedback, what used to be called constructive criticism. I don't think you're supposed to say that anymore. We've heard so many different approaches to this, right? I mean, you've probably heard of the quote unquote sandwich. I'll leave the first part out. You've probably heard of that. There's other methodology. I mean,
Yes.
like, what counsel would you give to the managers listening to this podcast, in terms of technique with giving effective feedback? How would Catherine do it?
Well, I can tell you and this, again, this is not me. This is through the research that I learned about at CRA. But one of the things that I found really, really helpful is, rather than trying to litigate the past with somebody, and you even see this, like, if you're trying to navigate with your children, like, you say, okay, well, you didn't do this, and then they're going to have 5 different arguments as to why they did it or why it was okay. Instead of doing that, really talking about going forward, like, here's what I'd like to see, or here's what you could do to be more successful, or here's next time we have a meeting with so and so, if you did these 3 things. So really putting it in the frame of going forward, these are some actions you can take or that I'd like to see you do. So it removes it from an argument into, a really kind of practical, action-oriented, positive thing that you can do. And people tend to really respond much better to that sort of thing. But I think the even more basic than that is just being willing to take the time and just being really willing to hear people, listen to people, have a two-way conversation. So often, and everyone's super busy and everyone's running, and so often all of our conversations, particularly in this Zoom world where you don't have that let's go grab a coffee together in the middle of between meetings, just the transactional nature of our conversations, rather than, hey, let me just hear what's going on with you, not with an agenda, not because I'm trying to change how you're doing things, but just actually hear, is something that we just don't do enough of. And if we really care about people and we really want them to be successful, we've got to listen.
And let's be honest, that's happening less than ever now. And
Less, absolutely.
this is such an important message to share: listening, caring. You brought up the word, coming from a place of love, or the term coming from a place of love. That's very interesting, because I feel like in a lot of work environments today, people might be anxious about talking about that. For a manager to say to a team member, "Hey, I love you. I want you to succeed. I care about you deeply," etc. It sounds like you're not afraid to say those things. That's just part of who you are. You do love your team, don't you?
Well, I do love them. And I think I really genuinely believe that we are called, well, Mother Angelica always used to say, we're all called to be great saints, don't miss the opportunity. And so then the question is, what's the field that we're playing on to make that happen? And for most of us, the field that we're playing on is a corporate environment. And I do think that you can either come at it in a segmented approach, which is, here's my day job, and then nights and weekends, I'm going to live out my, charism of whatever it is in my faith. But actually, that's not what we're being asked to do. What we're being asked to do is to bring all of that to work. And then, so what does that look like? If we are missionaries and our mission field is Wall Street or the law firm or wherever it is that we work, then what does that look like? And first and foremost, that looks like love, right? So what does that mean? But then there's also that question of, well, in practical terms, how do you do that when you're interfacing with people who may not be interested in faith or Jesus or any of that? And I think the answer is it still looks like love, and maybe even more. So, we really have an obligation, I think, to share with the world, particularly in the tumultuous world in which we live today, the peace and joy that we have knowing who our Savior is. Like, how do we bring that to other people? And so to me, the goal is for people to look at me and other people who really, believe, to say, wow, you're really happy and peaceful in the face of really difficult things. How did that come about? Where do I get some of that? And then you can say, well, let me introduce you to Jesus.
And Catherine, let's drill down on this a little bit because I know it's a big part of your message to us. You don't think that Catholic leaders and Catholic executives should have any fear about being very expressive about their faith in the workplace, although that seems to put a lot of people in an uncomfortable place. I think largely because they don't want to offend anyone, or they don't want some of the ill-conceived notions or falsehoods about the Catholic faith, especially that are out there, to be kind of used against them, I guess. I mean, those are my thoughts on it. But your message is to be courageous, right, and be very expressive about your faith.
Well, I think we owe it to the people around us. I mean, we've been given this incredible gift of faith, and it would be really mean not to share that with other people. And so then the question is, though, how do you do that in a way that actually opens a door and doesn't close it? And so, I have been super fortunate to have some wonderful mentors over the course of my life. And one in particular, when I was having this conversation some years ago with him, what he said to me, which I just found to be so helpful, is just a couple of really simple things. So particularly in a world where we would physically be in an office together, but even on Zoom, Monday mornings, people usually say, how was your weekend, and all that stuff. And whenever you're having those conversations, just putting out there, well, on Sunday after church, my family and I did blah, 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 whatever. So just putting it out there that, that you go to church, because even that for some people is an open door to then come back and say, like, oh, hey, where do you go to church? Or why do you go to church? Or and that kind of thing. So that's one thing. The other thing is that particularly when you're in a position of leadership, so often you're dealing with people's real life problems. And to say, when somebody comes and says, I need to be off work because I have a sick family member or whatever it is, to be able to say to them, hey, do you mind if I pray for you? And then for the next level up on that one is, if somebody says, yes, I'd be happy for you to pray for me, to then pray for them right there. I'm less good at that, to be frank, but I'm much better at, hey, can I pray for you? That I'm pretty good at. And then the other thing that for me actually was the most useful, completely by accident, by the way, is when I had a physical office that people came to, I had all my books there, and I had a bunch of books about faith. And I remember one time, a young gal, very shy computer science gal that worked on my team, one day came to me and said, hey, are those all your books? And I said, yeah. And she said, really, all of them? And she said, even a book by some author. And I said, I don't know. I don't remember all the authors. And the book was actually a book called Too Busy Not to Pray. And so I said, yeah, that's my book. And she just like opened up and said, I'm Christian, and I felt like my whole, both academic life and professional life, I had to hide because I felt like nobody would really, kind of embrace that. And can we talk about this? And we ended up having this wonderful, over time, lots of conversations about faith and all that. And so I kind of feel like then I decided to leave like books a lot more lying around, so like really try to find the books about faith that you can leave visibly so people feel like they have an open door, because there are a lot more Christians in our workplaces than we know. So there's sort of the folks who are already believers but feel like they have to hide, and giving them that opportunity to not. And then there's the folks who are on the journey. And I think for a lot of people, seeing people who are reasonable people, maybe intelligent people, maybe respected people, who also are people of faith, can kind of counteract the narrative that's so prevalent today in our society, that if you're a person of faith, then you're a rigid, hateful, extremist nut job. And so hopefully if a few more of us can be out there that kind of counteract that, hopefully that helps somebody.
And that's really why it's so important that people of faith are expressive, right? Because so many of these corporate leaders are just respected people in business that are practicing Catholics, Christians, other faiths. You know, if they're hiding that faith, if they're choosing to suppress that aspect of their personality, how can we ever attack that narrative and spread the truth, right? I mean,
And if the world ever needed it, it needs it now.
yeah, no, that's so beautiful. Thank you. So, Catherine, switching to the business side, when you were at Morgan, some of the other places you worked early in your career, I'm sure you were scoring a lot of wins, and doing some good work on behalf of the company and clients. Is there one achievement that really stands out as just like an awesome, thing that you're really proud of, for whatever reason, whether it was just, the product of really hard work, your team really coalesced around it, just, describe a big victory to us if you could.
Well, I think when I was at JP Morgan, we I think did 9 acquisitions in the commodities group that I was part of the management team of. And I think that for me, it may have been the acquisition of when JP Morgan acquired Bear Stearns. It was certainly a moment of lots of drama, certainly a moment that felt like a historical moment even at the time. But then on a more granular level, Bear Stearns had a very large energy trading platform called Bear Energy. And it was a real coming together for me of a lot of the work I had done before that to do that acquisition. It was certainly a very intense weekend of analyzing, their business and trying to understand how we put a value on that. But actually, ironically, the work I had done in Oklahoma at Williams, Bear had bought the Williams portfolio. So many of the large positions that were in the Bear portfolio are things that I had valued many years before
Wow.
in Williams. So it all kind of came together in that.
Hmm.
But I think the biggest thing that to me was a real victory in that was, whenever you have a situation of acquisition, particularly in with that much drama around it, where the people at Bear were really suffering. I mean, they had lost a lot. But to be able to integrate 2 businesses together successfully, and not have a lot of attrition of people, and to have people feel good about the fact that they're now being brought into a new company and treated respectfully. And I think we, the team at JP Morgan, did a really good job with that. I was very proud of that work, where it didn't feel like a 2-tiered system of the legacy people and the new people or anything like that. And we had a very successful business for years with that team. So that to me, it was a real lesson too on kind of how to deal with the personal side of the emotions that people have when they're in a difficult time, but yet make it a good outcome for everyone. So that to me was a real win.
That is a great example, and it's one that obviously is well known, widely discussed in the media. But that dynamic, that is a fascinating one of bringing in the newcomers, and you have these 2 companies, these 2 proud companies, and making sure that everybody, feels like they're on one team. That must have been challenging at first, but it sounds like you worked through it well.
And there were great people on both sides, some of whom I'm still very, very close to. You'll see in my bio, I'm on the board of CareerSpring, and CareerSpring's founder was the fellow from Bear, Paul Pasoli, who was brought in, and then he and I ended up co-heading a business together. So not only did we, I think, enjoy working together, but we continue to work together to this day.
Great example. And conversely, will you talk to us about, an episode where you struggled, where it just it wasn't clicking, and perhaps the lessons that you took away from that.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of those in everyone's career, and certainly in mine as well. I think I kind of think about it in 2 different ways. There's always going to be deals that you don't do, that you work hard on and you don't do, and I think you reach a point of maturity in your career where you realize that actually the deals you don't do are sometimes the best deals. And so rather than lamenting, that things didn't work out, kind of being okay with that is a big thing. But I think for me, there are a couple times that I moved from one company to the next, almost. Well, I can think of 2 instances, and I won't tell you the companies just because, I don't want to malign otherwise really good companies. But in 2 instances, I moved because I really wasn't comfortable with philosophically some of the things that the people were doing. Like I'll give you an example. At one instance, I had a manager who was technically excellent. I mean, people get successful because they're smart and they're good at what they do. But he was very, very comfortable in not being truthful with our counterparties on the other side. And it kind of came to a head where he said to me, you need to go say X, Y, and Z to this person that we're negotiating with. And I said to him, like, that's just not true. And he was like, who cares? Like, what does that have to do with anything? So when you're then confronted with that kind of situation where you just have a very different philosophical view on how are you going to live your life, and then at some point you have to just make a decision and you say, like, it's not worth it to me. I'd rather go somewhere else or take a career risk and do that rather than being in a situation where it's just not ethical. So unfortunately that's real. Like that happens in the companies that we work in. And so I think part of it is just having enough either clarity in your own head about what's important or enough support around you of people saying, you know what, it's just not worth it. Like you've got to be able to look yourself in the mirror with what you're doing. And so, but those are hard moments, right? Because then you feel like, wow, I'm walking away from a lot, but it's the right thing to do.
Catherine, it's another just excellent example and very relatable to our audience. I can't tell you how many people have told me, hey, here's my situation. I've encountered this unethical behavior. I've encountered this philosophical difference that's very challenging for me. And I'm working through the decision of do I fight to change it? Do I try to reform the culture of the team that I'm a part of, or do I seek out opportunities elsewhere? It sounded like in this specific case you ultimately chose to move on. But help me, just comment on that though. That whole dynamic of it's almost like a fight or flight response. You know what I mean? Like do I stay and try to change things? There's so many things I like about this job. There's so many things I like about this company, or do I go? What do you think?
Well,
how do you make that decision?
It's interesting because in the coaching work that I've done, I often have seen this, and I realize that I may be less circumspect than a lot of people are. I have a tendency, my personality is more just like, well, if you feel like it's not right, then it's not, and then it's time to move on, and that's okay. And so there may be value in maybe pausing a little bit longer, but I do think that for many people, the inertia is overwhelming. And so that ability to make a change is really hard for people. And I've tried to do this with my own children, but I also feel like it's just really important for people to get really comfortable with discomfort. Like if you want to stay somewhere because you're in a comfort zone, that's even a bigger reason why you should leave, because we don't grow in a comfort zone. We just don't. And so feeling like, oh wow, it's going to be a lot of work to make a change and go work somewhere else, well, that's actually probably pretty good. Like it's going to fire some new neurons in your head, and you're going to learn something new. That's great. And if there's something unethical going on, all the more reason that you shouldn't even think twice. It's just time to go.
I love it. Catherine, before we pivot to some other topics, let's talk about X Machina Capital. That's where you're serving as president right now, and that's kind of your top priority professionally. What's going on at X Machina Capital?
Well, what we're doing is investing in upstream oil and gas assets, which has been out of favor for a lot of investors, and kind of all the more reason why we think it's important. Certainly the returns are great in this sector, even before the oil price went crazy. But that's only part of it. Like from my perspective, if you are at all concerned about environmental issues, underinvesting in upstream oil and gas is one of the worst things that can happen, because if these oil fields aren't invested in properly, that's where leaks happen and spills happen and all these things. So to actually put the right amount of capital into these assets that we're still using, so whether people like it or not, I look outside here on 2nd Avenue and there's just tons of cars driving by. So we're using hydrocarbons. So the question is, how do we do it in a responsible way? So the first way is we invest in it properly. And then the second thing is, how do we then think about how to transform these assets for the future, because we're not going to be using hydrocarbons as intensely as we are today in the future, but you need people who are actually standing in that gap to transform these assets into other things. So at Ex Machina, what we're doing is we're making this investment in these fields and transforming them through, we have a sustainable technologies division, investing in some really, really innovative clean technology to do plugging and abandonment of wells cheaper, better, more long lasting, better detection of methane, but also other ways of transforming these assets for a new generation of energy through geothermal technology, through solar fields, through other cleaner technological use of energy to generate electricity. So it's definitely a transformational story, as well as how do we manage the assets that we have today as effectively as possible. And now there's even more of a focus on the domestic production of fuels, given all of the dysfunction in the world today.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at what's going on right now. The highest gas prices ever. I think somebody sent me a picture from California yesterday, $10 per gallon premium fill up. I mean, unbelievable. It's just crazy. People have discovered that we're buying oil from Putin's Russia. Obviously we've been buying oil from Saudi Arabia and Iran and other questionable regimes for a long time. So I mean, I guess the question is, I think we all want to get away from these carbon producing energy sources. But Catherine, what's the right path? Because everybody says different things. Everybody criticizes everybody's position so much. Chart the course for us for a responsible transition away from these carbon producing products towards clean energy. How would you do it?
Well, I do think that there's a lot of emotion around this topic, and it's super helpful to step away from the emotion and to look at the facts, both in terms of what our current infrastructure can support, also how the physics of our electrical system works, and what are the demands for energy that we have in our world. And so when you think about, for instance, electric vehicles, which there's definitely a growth of and a continued projection for many, many more. So on the one hand, electric vehicles don't emit, in the way that strict hydrocarbon vehicles do, but you're buying that electricity from somewhere, right? And so what that means is that you're buying it from the electrical grid. Well, if you look at, how much of our electricity is still being produced by coal, how much of it is being produced by oil? I think this past winter, like in New England, 20% of the electrical generation for a period of time came from oil because we were lacking the fuel needed to generate enough electricity. So this electricity comes from somewhere, and that somewhere continues to emit, greenhouse gases and other things like that. And so, I think just having everybody transition over to everything electrical doesn't solve the problem at all. Not to mention the fact that our electrical grids can't support everybody plugging in all the time, right? Because they're just not built for that right now. So there's a path to getting there, but it's not tomorrow. Then the other thing too is that, the increased growth of things like solar and wind and all that is happening everywhere. But also, the way that electricity works, so you have to balance it because, the wind blows when the wind blows and the sun shines when the sun shines, but that may not be when you actually want to use your electricity. So people then say, well, okay, well then we'll just use batteries to store that energy. Absolutely. We don't have enough batteries right now to support that in the fullest possible way to eliminate hydrocarbons. By the way, mining for the metals for batteries has its own environmental problems. So all of these things there's no quick fix, there's no simple solution. Somebody was telling me the other day, and I don't know if it's exactly true, but they were saying that your average solar panel lasts 20 years. So then once you're done using that solar panel, it ends up in a landfill or, some other way. So there's no problem that doesn't create a problem. No solution that doesn't create a new problem. Doesn't mean we shouldn't move in that direction at all. And I think we're doing that. It's just overlaying on this a real dose of reality of where are we in this cycle. So my view is that hydrocarbons are going to be around for my useful life, for sure. And so then the question is, how do we do that in a responsible way to minimize any of the damage, and then to recognize that everything has pluses and minuses. So I'll give you another example. For the longest time, nuclear was, vilified as, the bad thing. But the reality is that nuclear actually doesn't emit, greenhouse gases. So is it bad or is it good? Well, there's arguments on both sides. So these are complicated topics. And I feel like too often in the public discourse, we reduce them into headlines that don't adequately explore the nuance of these problems. So it's complicated, but these are really important topics because we all really rely on energy and electricity for the world that we live in.
Yeah, and going back to our Catholic faith, look at the consequences of all that indecision and all that confusion around this topic. I mean, the poor and the working class were already facing skyrocketing consumer prices, groceries, everything, inflation, everything they purchase is going through the roof. And then we hit them with record high gas prices on top of that. I mean, drawing back to our faith, where we're supposed to be concerned about, the poor and the marginalized and those that are struggling in life. Man, it feels like we're kind of letting them down, aren't we, Catherine?
Well, so it's really, I think one of the beautiful things about our faith is that Catholic is neither Republican nor Democrat. It's neither conservative nor liberal. It's Catholic. And so, Catholics get criticized on the one hand for being too right-wing around things like abortion and same-sex marriage. And then they get accused of being too left-wing by being, too much focused on the poor and all of that, which I love. I love that about our faith because it should be both, right? I mean, we should be concerned about what we're concerned about is people, right? I mean, that at the heart of it is we're trying to do the right thing by the people that God has given us in our lives and around us. But you're absolutely right that we're in this really inflationary environment, and it looks like there's no end in sight anytime soon. Possibly even a stagflation environment, which we haven't seen since the late 70s, which is hugely problematic. But yes, I mean, inflation is a regressive tax and really hurts the poor more than anybody else. And that has to be something that societally, and certainly as Catholics, that we really care about it. And we have to think about what are the policies that make it so that we're not harming people who are working hard to put food on their table. Every dollar that comes out of that comes away from the food on their table. That's not okay. Like we need to do better than that.
Yeah, well said. Another big story right now. We're coming up on a month since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I know that's a topic that you're following closely. You have deep links to that region of the world. You're married to a Polish man. You have family and loved ones in the region directly impacted by all this. Talk to us about your analysis of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, Catherine.
It's really interesting to have both kind of the dispassionate looking at the news and kind of seeing what's going on perspective, and then of course the family side of things. So my husband, who is heading there on Wednesday this week. So I'm looking forward to hearing what it looks like on the ground when he gets there. I mean, fortunately, the fighting has not extended into Poland at this point, but about 3 million refugees have arrived in the last month, and so you can imagine that that surge of people in a relatively small area has a big impact. But I think it's beautiful to see the response from the Polish people, and there are a few places in this world where people are more expressively Catholic than Poland, and you see that in how in this. I think you probably saw there was a beautiful story about moms leaving strollers for other moms to be able to come and use that when they come in. So we have, my father-in-law lives in Warsaw, and he's bedridden, and the ladies who care for him are Ukrainian. And just over the weekend, the daughter and grandchildren of one of those ladies finally made it, and they're staying there with my father-in-law. So it's a beautiful thing that they finally made it out. We're waiting now this week for some more family to come out, and hopefully they'll make it out as well. So, on the one hand, like everything, it's just gut-wrenching to see how really evil people can be to each other, and it's just heartbreaking to see that. But on the other hand, it just shows it showcases an opportunity for the goodness that people have, and the kind of the extension of love and mercy to each other. So I guess what it really says to me is at any given time in the world, there are people who are refugees who are struggling, who are, in danger of losing their lives because of the aggression of somebody else. So while this is front and center for us, there are parts of the world where, this is just the way it is, whether it's Somalia, whether it's, Egypt or Ethiopia, they've all had really difficult times all around the world. There's, no shortage of challenges that people are facing. It just, to me, shows that there's never enough prayer. We need to continue, as Pope Francis said, to pray for Russia and Ukraine, and the people involved on all sides in all of that. And God forbid that this turns into World War III, but at least we know the important thing, which is where we're spending eternity, God willing. So that's what we need to keep our eye on.
Yeah, so well said. And you and I both love Poland, and as if Poland needed another reason to be proud and to demonstrate to the world what Christian compassion looks like. I mean, here
Exactly.
they are, just wide open border, come over, no passport, no documentation, find refuge here in Poland. I mean, it's just it's a really spectacular and beautiful thing to behold. You're right.
Yes.
With a dark tragedy going on next door, it just it's really raw. Hey, Catherine, our focus, of course, is on economics, international finance. That's what you and I are interested in. What's your evaluation of some of the financial methods that have been used against the Putin regime, like the sanctions regime and the taking Russian oligarchs and certain banks out of international financial institutions, et cetera, restricting sales on oil exports, that type of thing. Are those effective tactics? What's your analysis of those methods?
I guess my short answer is only time will tell. I feel like on the one hand, it's better than doing nothing. I frankly, I worry about, there's a lot of good Russian people in Russia who are victims now too. And that's war, right? There's no good way to protect the innocent people in the aggressing country. It's just one of the difficult things that's always the case. So I do worry about that, but I do think that, shy of us engaging in actual warfare with that regime, it's probably the best we can do to try to at least put some pressure on what the situation is. But will it be enough? I doubt it. But I also really, really would hate to trigger World War III by us getting, involved in a military thing. I mean, I'm certainly no military strategist, so it's really a question from an economic perspective. And obviously, as you know, since I have focused most of my attention on the commodity side of things, I guess what I would hope in terms of silver lining, you'd like to hope that there's a rational end to this that is contained and limited, and that this is a blip rather than the beginning of something much more protracted and horrible. But I guess I would also like to hope that the world pauses for a moment and says, well, hang on a second. If Europe is relying on Russia for their energy, that's just not a good idea. And if we're relying on other countries for, LNG or something like that, that's a bad idea. Like, don't do that, And so I think it should give everybody pause to think about who are you doing business with? I mean, frankly, we saw this a bit during the pandemic, right? Where our supply chains were really disrupted. And then you have to ask yourself, well, shouldn't we have more manufacturing here so that we aren't so reliant on other countries? And so I do think that if there's a silver lining in this whole thing, hopefully that's it, that people start thinking differently about how much they're relying on other countries. But, will we be able to stop this? Only time will tell. And I'm clear, I think if somebody is so, I don't know if crazy is the right word, but, unstable, then maybe nothing rational helps. I don't know.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, Catherine, as we just start to wind down our time together, I just wanted to get kind of a capstone question in with you. I mean, you've seen every layer of business leadership, from starting out, through the ranks, and now as a member of corporate boards and CEO and president of your company. You know, are you sure that in those really tough moments, you've had to make tough calls when you've been faced with ethical dilemmas, all the things that come along with being in charge and being a senior leader, your faith has been a source of strength to you in those moments, right? And it's made you a better leader in those moments when it's really counted, right? Would you just close with a comment on that?
Well, I heard, it might have been again Father Josh in his podcast talking about it a while ago, but basically what he was talking about was, the form of prayer where you pray and sort of imagine that you're in the setting. I think it's the Ignatian prayer. And he was saying that he began this prayer in of Jesus, riding in on the donkey, and he all of a sudden started to imagine that he was the donkey. And he was like, hang on, I don't want to imagine that. I want to be, an apostle or, somebody in the crowd or whatever it is. But he was like, no, I'm the donkey. And so he started to imagine, what would it be like to be the donkey? And he was like, well, actually, you're probably frightened because there's all this going on around you. You don't understand, but you're the closest one to Jesus. Jesus is right there with you. I mean, you can touch Jesus because you're the donkey that Jesus is riding. And you don't need to see what's going on because Jesus can see what's going on and he's directing your path. All you need to do is follow what he's telling you to do. So he had this whole narrative around be the donkey that Jesus is riding. And that has stuck with me so much. And I do feel like, there are times when you have either really difficult decisions to make, or it's just not clear, is something going to work out or not work out? And that whole mental image of, I just need to be the donkey, let Jesus do the driving, and I just take one step after the other. And it was even Mother Angelica, if you ever read the Raymond Arroyo book about her starting EWTN, and she always said she didn't have a business plan. I do have a business plan, but she said she didn't have a business plan because it would never be as good as the business plan that God has for her. And her job is to just step out in faith every day. And that has really resonated with me a lot too. So I think that just not being fearful, just realizing that when things are really difficult or there's a hard decision to make, that God brought us, each of us here for a reason to this place. And all we need to do is really rely on him and really pray about it. And then in worst comes to worst, I'm fortunate that I have a wonderful priest in Father Gerald Murray. And whenever I really stuck, I can go chat with him and he gives great advice. And that's been really helpful too.
So good, Catherine. This has just been wonderful. For our listeners and viewers that have enjoyed hearing from you today, how can they learn more about you? Is there a website or a social media profile that you'd like to refer them to?
Well, LinkedIn, Catherine Flax is the easiest way to reach me for sure. And I try to be good about responding to everybody. I maybe miss some people who are trying to sell me stuff, but other than that, I'm pretty good about responding. So hopefully I'll do that. So that's for sure the easiest way.
Yeah, I would say other than amateur sales pitches, you're very charitable and you always get back to people, and I think that's one of your nice qualities. So this has been so much fun, Catherine. We're good friends, and you're just one of the good people out there doing great work, and it's been a privilege to get to know you better and to share your story with our listening audience today. This has been the Faith and Finance Forum, hosted by the Catholic Finance Association, presented by Aquinas Wealth Advisors. We've been on with Catherine Flax, talking about strategy, leadership, faith, and all the good things that go along with it. Thank you for being with us today. God bless you all. Be well.